live. It is Wednesday, June 24th, 2020, 5:01 p.m. We're a minute short, for which my deepest apologies will not convey the depth of my sorrow. I have a glass of champagne with a touch of creme de cassis, and Kate has the monologue today, which has no rules except that it must end with the fact that we're not allowed to have fun anymore, and an introduction of our guest. Kate, the floor is yours.
I'm enjoying a giant beer, not a glass of champagne. So I've been doing this. I think I've talked about this a few times in the show, this webinar on 2:30 every day for the last 3 days and like 2 more. But today we got some fun breaking a little bit of news. I had gotten a draft leaked to me of the Pact Act, which was done by Senator Schatz and Senator Thune's office, which was I think I've worked with Schatz's office before, as Jonathan knows. I think they're very well intentioned and want to do really good work. And so it's not like this is kind of the Hawley bill or something like that. But had some very kind of almost anachronistic seeming elements to it. The main one being that there was specific language, and I'll just read the language specifically. Subject to subsection E, making available a live company representative to take user complaints through a toll-free telephone number during regular business hours for not fewer than 8 hours per day and 5 days per week. So they literally are legislating this call center to take people's complaints on content moderation. And, the day today was perfect because we had Alexander McElvray, AMAC from Twitter and Google, and former deputy chief technology officer speaking to us. And we had Charlotte and Dave Wilner, who had both wrote the book on Facebook's content moderation policies in the shadow of 230. And we had Daphne Keller, who writes prolifically about Section 230 and its import. And so we had this great kind of and we just read those things, and you just should have seen Dave's face. Dave was just and he was you should literally take a pile of money and give everyone a pile of money and burn it to heat their homes rather than do this call center idea. It is such a waste of time.
It's only fair that if phone companies have to endure customer complaints on Twitter, why shouldn't Twitter have to endure customer complaints over the phone?
Yeah, maybe that's true. And so I just was anyways, all of that kind of got people were very apoplectic, but I really tried to bring it around to the idea that this is actually well-intentioned, and it reflects something that's super fundamental, which is that basically people want accountability in online spaces and how they're allowed to speak. And that's what Schatz and Thune are trying to bring through, which is very different than what Hawley is trying to bring through, which is that Hawley wants to be allowed to speak, and he wants his cohorts to be allowed to speak however they want to speak, no matter who it offends. And I think that there is difference in principles motivating one party than another. And anyways, by the end of this went on to Twitter. My excerpt from Twitter and Dave's reaction went on from somebody who was watching. Schatz replied saying, counterpoint, call centers are a great idea. And then someone deleted that tweet. And so then I've tried to clear the air since then and kind of been this is not as bad. The call centers might be a bad idea, but there is certainly there's certainly room for some low hanging fruit, and a lot of the bill is actually well constructed and speaks to empowering state AGs to bring claims and things like that. But I think would be low hanging fruit to improve Section 230. So with that, we are not allowed to have fun on Twitter anymore, and we are not allowed to have fun anymore in general.
And apparently Brian Schatz isn't allowed to have fun anymore.
I feel very bad because I really do like him and his office, and I've worked with them often. And so I really did not mean to drag them online. It was just this one provision that I thought was particularly not well thought out. Or not well, hard. It was going to be very hard and expensive to implement and not have the payoff that people thought it might. And anyways, now I've kind of learned that they are, and I actually take this as I don't know, like a sign of how well-intentioned they are is that apparently the bill is kind of going back into draft phase and people are talking about it, and it's not going to be released today as it was originally planned. But in any event, we are not allowed to fund anymore. And in lieu of fun, we have Jonathan Zittrain, who came up multiple times also in this webinar today, because he is a professor of law at Harvard Law School and one of the founders of the Berkman Klein Center, which is works on technology and internet studies and law. And he is a good friend and a brilliant mind in this area. And we're so glad to have you. You are the Matt Damon of In Lieu of Fun podcast, because we have tried to put you on so many times. And then like Ben, it always happens to be like, we rarely miscommunicate. Ben and I rarely miscommunicate on this stuff, but we have just like happened to do that like 2 or 3 times with you. So like, we are very sorry, but we are so thrilled to have you today.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks.
So we're going to talk about contact tracing, which I know that you've been working on a lot, and I'm fascinated.
So I want to say a word of...
But go ahead, talk first about Flynn. But first, we have a big kind of breakout about Flynn, so we should probably.
No. I want to say a word in introduction. Let's not.
Sorry, you keep freezing.
Am I breaking up?
You promised one word and could not even meet that standard.
All right.
This happens sometimes.
All right, give me a second.
So. Anyways, Jonathan, we're going to talk about contact tracing. You don't have to weigh in about Flynn. I think it's just that we've covered it so much because of Ben's kind of NatSec background and everything. So we probably should touch on it just because it's kind of a crazy decision that came and unexpected.
I don't think we need to talk about Michael Flynn today, honestly.
Oh, okay.
I mean, if people want a walkthrough of the Flynn opinion, post it in the Q&A and I'll give you a quick one. But honestly, I think this decision is likely to be pretty short-lived, and I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on it, at least not until the DC Circuit declines to review it en banc. If the DC Circuit declines to review it en banc and it's actually going to be law, we may need to talk about it. But let's wait until then before we spend a lot of time on it. I do want to say, however, an additional word in introduction of Jonathan Zittrain, because he has a really important distinction in my book among law professors, which is when Edward Snowden did his Snowden-y revelations, there were a relatively small number of law professors who chose to engage the world of NSA surveillance in a non-ideological and constructive and interesting and ecumenical fashion that was based on fact and reality and as much listening as howling. And or even a third as much or a tenth as much listening and howling. And one of those people was Jonathan Zittrain. And that was a situation in which the mob zigged, and a very small number of people, I'm not even talking about zagging, because zagging is you're knee-jerking in a different direction, but just resisting the zig and saying, what do we know here? What don't we know? What would be useful? What's the information that we want? And how can we set up dialogue to get to that information? And that was a enormous of great value. A lot of it took place behind closed doors. Some of it still takes place behind closed doors. It was exceedingly valuable, and a lot of relationships were built out of it that were substantial. And so I just want to say that's a really important function that law professors can play when they choose to play it, instead of shrieking about things.
Well,
None of
and
which
I
is what
appreciate
we're
that.
here to talk about.
I was just going to say,
We're
too,
here to talk about that incredible hanging chair in back of you. That is actually the subject. That thing is awesome. And where can I get one?
Well, thank you. I think we got it in old-fashioned speak mail order, which means we must have just clicked our way to it on Amazon back in the day. It disassembles very easily, and it's quite light, so you can kind of haul it up the hill when you want. But I was just going to thank you for the introduction about that group thinking about the Snowden stuff, a group that later ended up coming out with a document called Don't Panic, which was about the so-called going dark problem and trying to reconcile the pleas from folks like Jim Comey, at the time the FBI director, echoed now by a lot of people in law enforcement and the administration. In fact, there's legislation about it, about the ways in which encryption are going to make it hard for law enforcement to do its job. And saying, no, don't worry about it. There's so many smart devices, Zoom and other webcams and everything else with sensors everywhere, that the fact that you can't get into an iPhone is not going to be such a big deal if you're law enforcement. So don't panic. Maybe the corresponding thing is for civil liberties folks, you should probably panic, even if encryption stays the way it is, because there are so many more leaky forms of surveillance available in the world that probably will become routine. Anyway, that's it was great to have the group be thinking about that.
So I was thinking, there's so many things I would love to talk to you about, but I kind of want to work our way, hopefully, for the first 15 minutes, like, let's just talk about kind of some of the basic stuff around 230 and what's happening right now, and then also kind of some of the encryption debate and the Earn It Act and things like that. And then I'd love to talk about digital contact tracing, which I know you've been working a lot on. And I'm honestly, I really have not, with everything else that's been going on, not had the time to do as much work on. So you'd be educating me as well as everyone else. But let's start kind of with Section 230. We've been having there's this conversation happening, all of these bills coming out to kind of reform it. Do you think that there's anything specific in Section 230 that is low hanging fruit? It's such a hard problem to regulate the internet, so to speak. But do you think that there's anything that would make that they're just, it would be easy for Congress to just legislate this one thing without it being politicized?
Yeah, I find myself more an incrementalist in saying, look, if there's a particular problem that has enough of a kind of consistent configuration that to legislate it makes sense for the next 15 years, at least, then talk about that problem and legislate against it. And maybe Sesta Fosta is an example of that. I mean, a lot of people were against legislation in that area for fear of what it would mean for the rest of the CDA, rather than specifically about sex trafficking or something, which is what that legislation concerned itself with. But that meant that the biggest objections to it were more that it was unnecessary. Already, you could go after operations you want to go after without needing to change the CDA, rather than it might be affirmatively harmful, although there were a few arguments on that front. So I'd be wanting to say to people anxious to change CDA, be upfront about the problem you're trying to solve and figure out the most minimal mincing way to solve it. And it's because it's against a backdrop of people who think they don't like what the immunities of the CDA 230 stand for, come often from opposite points of view. You have some people saying that the problem is that the services aren't neutral and they should just let the conversations flow, whatever that means. But that we don't want them getting into the mix on things and expressing as the services their view about right and wrong, or supporting Democrats versus Republicans or something. So just leave it alone. And if you don't leave it alone, you don't get the benefit of the 230 immunity. And then from the other side, you have people saying, no, 230 is terrible because it means that they can leave it alone. And when they don't leave it alone, they get a get out of jail free card. And why aren't they intervening more for all these terrible things like sex trafficking? And so if you have both sides hating 230 for opposite reasons, it really seems to me important to be clear about what problem they're trying to solve if they want to change it.
I love that you brought that up, because tomorrow's conversation is between Carey Goldberg, who is this incredibly progressive leftist feminist lawyer who brings class action civil lawsuits against tech companies, and David French, who is kind of very evangelical Christian.
He's a social conservative.
Yeah. And they both actually, David does not believe in reform of 230, which is kind of surprising because a lot of his cohort does. And Carey desperately wants reform of 230. And so, but there is this, you are exactly right. It is a fascinating outcome, I think. And I say this to reporters sometimes, but I don't think they're totally grokking what I'm saying, which is I'm like, you have people that are so far to the left and you people that are so far to the right that they bend around and find each other in this weird way, that they're and no one is completely correct. And I think that's a great way of putting it. I really like the idea of state AGs and state law becoming applicable under 230, so that you don't that platforms have to meet state law in the same way that they have to meet federal law. That to me seems like the most serious harms are coming from those types of behavior. Ben, what are you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, I actually do think there's a neutral principle that we could start with, which is that a platform that knowingly tolerates illegal activity, and I don't mean merely child pornography or sex trafficking, but knowingly tolerates illegal activity, should not be immune for the civil liability associated with the illegal activity that it is knowingly providing a platform for. Notice that I didn't say anything that has an ideological valence there.
But Ben, I think that's the same as just getting rid of 230, because you wouldn't be liable for non-illegal activity anyway. So the only thing CDA is shielding you from is illegal activity.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think of defamation as illegal activity?
Well, no. So I was actually I was thinking of criminal law when I said that, and I think it is perfectly reasonable to say, hey, in a real-time platform, if you defame me, the platform has no necessary way to check that in real time. And so we want to immunize traditional publishing torts. But if you are actively, if the platform is actively tolerating, activity that in and of itself would violate the criminal law, there is they shouldn't be immunized against the civil components of the liability for that.
I love the phrase actively tolerating.
I know. I mean, it's actually, Jay-Z, say more about that.
Well, no, it's just, how do you actively, tolerating is generally a passive thing.
No,
I think what you really mean is tolerating with knowledge.
Yes, when it is brought to your attention, choosing not to do something about it.
So that in the pre-230 world is what we would have called distributor liability, the liability, say, of a bookstore, which was not complete. A bookstore could be responsible for a defamatory book on its shelves if it had actual knowledge. Then the question is, well, what's actual knowledge? If I go into the store and talk to the clerk and ask to speak to the manager, I say, I want to talk to the owner, and I say, guess what? This book defames me. Now you know, I'll wait. I don't know what constitutes knowledge there. And this is all against a backdrop of, if you condition the immunity on anything that is going to be fact intensive, like what did you know and when did you know it, then you can't enjoy the immunity in any case, because when somebody brings a case against you, and if you're at Twitter or Facebook or something, I know, cry me a river, but you're going to get 100 cases a day. None of those cases gets dismissed on the pleadings or in early stages where you just say, even if everything they say is true, I win. it's, oh, if what they say is true, that I actually knew about this, well, then I guess I would lose. So now we have to have depositions, and when was that toll-free number called to tell me about this problem? And now every case has to be fully litigated.
Okay, but I want to ask you about I want to give you an example of active toleration. And that is, the site Omegle, which I have up on my screen right now. Now, Omegle is...
Do I really want to visit this?
No,
no,
don't do it.
No, I think you probably don't, but I will read you the relevant portions. Omegle is not a social media platform designed to help child predators meet victims. But I will say that if you were going to design a platform for child predators to meet victims, it would look a lot like Omegle. The slogan of the site is "Talk to Strangers," and it is a video chat where they pair you up with a stranger. And in the fine print down below, it says, and this is on the front page of the site, it says, understand that human behavior is fundamentally uncontrollable, that the people you encounter on Omegle may not behave appropriately, and that they are solely responsible for their own behavior. Use Omegle at your own peril. So
I feel it sounds like chat roulette back in the day.
It does sound like chat roulette, doesn't it? Sound like chat roulette?
Only it's video, right?
Chat roulette was video.
Was chat roulette video?
Yeah.
You think it's a gambling site?
Yeah.
No, I thought it was like they pair you up with somebody and you chat.
Oh, to chat? No, it's like literally like every 30 seconds your video feed changes.
Oh, no. So this is, they'll pair you up with somebody and you can talk for as long as you want.
This is like a long-term relationship chat roulette.
I'm amazed, by the way, Ben, that you're like advertising the site.
No, I mean,
example.
Danielle Zittrain and I wrote a whole paper urging reform of 230 and used Omegle as sort of our central example. So I just want to use it for you as an example of active toleration. The knowledge is sufficient that they are affirmatively saying our users are going to misbehave, and you're using it at your own risk. We are not responsible.
But on that front, I mean, I haven't been browsing the terms of service of like the major platforms lately, but I'm sure all of them have, probably in all caps, which to skip over, the section of their terms of service that's going to say exactly that. I mean, any competent lawyer would tell them to say that. It feels to me almost like a good reason to do exactly the kind of incrementalist state of concrete problem and then solve it without going too far kind of thing, which is not then change all of 230 to be all about illegal behavior, however any state wants to define it, including a civil component to a criminal law, but rather we are worried about protecting kids. And if a site is basically making it so that kids are going to get themselves in trouble and they are especially vulnerable because they have worse judgment than adults, then yeah, solve that problem. And, you'll have maybe people worried about the, the cleaning chemical escaping the beaker, but like at least just talk about that problem rather than generally repealing CDA for all illegal activity.
Yeah, I this, Ben. I agree with Jonathan on this point. Like, I completely agree with this. Like, I think that it's an abhorrent site. I completely agree with you. I also don't go to 8chan or 4chan, and I don't go to most of Reddit for like what it's worth. But I don't like necessarily think that those should not exist. And I also think that like it's very, very hard to create. This is something that I really generally disagree with contracts academics who try to enter this space and be like, let's solve it all with consent. Let's solve it all with like these like bubbles to click through. Let's like make sure you can see, oh, you're looking at cookies. Oh, did you know that you're giving cookies? No, it's like everyone clicks through that cookies like thing just to get to the webpage. They don't think about it. This is basic kind of click wrap contract law. I agree. Like, I just don't understand how repealing all of Section 230 resolves this. Like, what are the harms that you specifically think are perpetrated that you would want to hold the site responsible for?
So I don't think Omegle should exist without an age
gating
checking limitation. I mean,
And
I
by the
think
way, I mean, again, I don't know the details, but it sounds like it might violate federal law.
Yeah, it does. I think it does. I think it has been found to violate federal law, Jay-Z.
yeah, I mean, you mean after FOSTA?
Yes.
Sure, but I mean,
But even before that.
But even CDA 230 didn't purport to limit federal criminal law.
Federal criminal law is always like a thing that like
always
so
been outside of 230.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the problem that I was saying was like, if you really want to empower CDA 230 to like address some of these problems, have it also pinned to state criminal law, because then you don't have to empower individual causes of action, which are just about money mostly and are there's just like a lot going on. And very tedious. But I would say that like, it's just like low hanging fruit. Like there's not a huge delta difference between state and federal law in a lot of places.
What about Carey's Grindr case? Why should Grindr not have to think about liability in the situation in which not only are they providing the platform for somebody to stalk somebody else and harass that person, but then when it is brought to their attention, their response is, we don't have to do anything about this because CDA 230 means we're immune. So your client can put it where the moon don't shine.
Yeah, in the sense
like, why is that the right incentive structure?
I think the Grindr case is a very sympathetic one for Carey and her client.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and it's a total echo of the very first CDA 230 case, the Zittrain case of 1997, where you had somebody on AOL who he actually wasn't even on AOL. He was just some guy, not on AOL. He's like one of the 3 people in America, not on AOL. And somebody on AOL represented themselves as him, gave out his phone number and said, "Hi, I'm selling funny Oklahoma bombing t-shirts. Call and order now." And of course, there was a huge backlash. A radio station in Oklahoma City brought it up in the morning drive time, obviously disapprovingly, and gave out the phone number. The guy got death threats, though, all the usual stuff that you could imagine, and then sued AOL because he had called their customer service how many times and been like, "This isn't me, please take down the message," and they didn't do it. So it seems to me like very much the same template as the Grindr case. And the Zittrain case said, look, take it up with Congress. They told you can't have a cause of action. Now, if we're going to fix that problem, and that is from Ken Zittrain's point of view, absolutely a problem. It's totally sympathetic. Come on, AOL, stop dropping floppy disks on people's heads and fix your problem. And the fact is, though, I'd want to look for a way to make it so that in those cases where it's basically incontrovertible that there's a problem and that the company should know it, that they'd better take action, but not in the 1,800 other cases where it's this person says this other person says this, and they face crushing civil liability if they make the wrong call in the 20 seconds they have to review it.
And what do you think that looks like? Is there a fix that you could make to 230 that would disaggregate the case where the platform is unambiguously aware of the situation and deciding not to do something about it, from the situation where they have 20 seconds to make a call and they make a call and somebody gets hurt?
I guess for my part, I've been in Kate's view, I'd start slicing and dicing on maybe there are cases of ongoing harm or threat of harm so serious and so segregable into the 1% or 0.5% of the instances of things going on that people are unhappy about, so much so that they might sue. That's all right, I'm getting swatted 3 times a day, and I think it's linked to this thing that's happening that's misrepresenting me, or is it false about me? And all right, maybe that gets more than 30 seconds of attention from a company that has a reach of a certain amount, a certain size. And so that then the company really does have to sit down and devote some energy to getting into the nitty gritty and figuring out what's up. But figuring out how to make that not every case, but just the few cases where there really is a lot of harm being brought down on somebody that doesn't deserve it. That could be one way to try to what's the statutory language to fix 230 on that front? I don't know. It's probably more than a sentence long, but would be meant to fix the worst abuses while retaining the benefits of the general immunity.
Yeah, Jonathan, I completely agree with you. Carey is texting me because she's been watching. And this is
tell her to show up.
I love that she's using the phone system too. Once again, it's the plain old telephone system that's doing the trick here.
Well, yeah, I know. She's saying how I will read it in a second, but she's distinguishing her case from Zittrain. But I actually I wanted to actually, just for the audience who are probably not in the mix on what Herrick v. Grindr, Carey's case was. Carey's case was a case in the Southern District of New York and then the Second Circuit that was around her client, Matthew Herrick, was a gay man who had used the website, which is a dating website, to match people geographically in your area. So it takes your geolocation and you kind of find people in your area.
I don't think he had ever used it, actually. I think
he had.
His ex set up an account in his name and used it to have people show up demanding sex from him. Was it even his account?
No, it certainly wasn't. He had used it, but it was not his account. So it was an account that was a counterfeit account that looked like him and used his picture and did everything else. And there's a whole other side of this technologically about how they manage the geolocation thing and how that happened. But basically it sent a bunch, the ex ran this fake account and sent all of these, said, I have a violent rape fantasy, come to my door and rape me, just barge in if I answer, don't even stop and say no. And, there's it literally over the course of a couple of weeks, thousands upon thousands of men came to his house and did this type of thing. And he just was stalked, and he reached, it's funny, actually, I talked to Daphne Keller about this. And she's just the thing that just strikes me as so stupid about this is why Tinder did nothing, or not Tinder, sorry, Grindr did nothing. That is just so on Grindr. They should have taken that down. They surely had some type of mechanism for dealing with this. Why they wouldn't just take down this account is so dumb to me. But for whatever reason, they didn't. Carey put forward all of these kind of claims, and they for civil liability to sue Grindr for a lot of money for enabling all this harm to her plaintiff, Matthew Herrick. Separately, there were criminal charges pending that Carey was not dealing with Matthew Herrick. And with Matthew Herrick's partner, he's currently locked away in jail, I think for 3 to 5 years right now, after his sentencing. But they all got thrown out because of Section 230 immunity and the fact that you couldn't go after Grindr because this was apparently kind of a content protected. And I think that this is the forefront of the conversation in which you have a service that is not really about speech and is more about conduct, more about service than it is about hosting. If that makes sense, you're developing a program to partner people with people, much like what you're talking about, Ben, with the whatchamacallit site. I'm happy to forget the name of it. The one that
we're going to leave out the name from now on.
Okay. Anyways,
don't want people to visit Omegle.
But it's not. It's not about the hosting. It's not about hosting the content. So I just kind of think that this was kind of I just think, and she got a lot of crap from people that were 230 experts that were kind of this is a dumb argument.
Say on that front, I feel both in a case like the Grindr case and in cases like those around the right to be forgotten, which, among American academics, myself included, is not a very popular rule, the European right to be forgotten. You can petition Google, say, to, have something true about you that's on the web removed from the Google index because it's, quote, no longer relevant. And then Google has 30 seconds or whatever it wants to take to make a judgment about the public's right to know versus your right. But on the other hand, I feel that's the right to be forgotten as implemented is a very bad solution to what should be acknowledged as a real problem. The idea that people's identities are defined to everybody they might meet by whatever that person that they're meeting Googles about them, and all of the prejudice that comes with that. And similarly, the idea that Carey's client has to endure this and have no recourse. I just want to be among the first, or at least among the group, to say that is a real problem. And I want to figure out a way to solve it that also at the same time doesn't end up undermining a lot of other stuff that we like. And there's probably a way to do that. So,
well, let me have my Marshall McLuhan moment, my Woody Allen. I have Carey Goldberg right here, and she is going to totally outflank me in hatred of CDA 230, because I dislike CDA 230 in that mild sort of way that, but Carey hates 230 with the fire of 1,000 burning suns. And when she's done hating it for the day, she has a stiff drink, and that burns more hatred for CDA 230. So Carey, outflank me from, I don't know whether it's the left or the right or the burning sun center, but like defend my position here.
Your flanks are just fine, Ben. I can't outflank you even if I tried. I'm glad you guys are talking about it. I just want to respond to like what Jonathan said, that there must be a way to fix this without sweeping in all this stuff that we don't want to be censored, and we don't want to give our social media companies an opportunity to over censor. And I really think that I thought that the recommendations that the Department of Justice put out this week, and having a cyberstalking carve out, and having a carve out for situations where the platform is being a bad Samaritan, and having these like pretty narrow bad Samaritan's not a narrow carve out, but
I was just going to say that.
If it's a situation where you're reporting over and over again about criminal activity that's happening on your platform, and and it's verified, and they can actually look at the profiles themselves to confirm that this stuff is happening on their platforms. Then it seems then you've got an ostrich with its head in the sand situation, and it's just so it's extraordinary that victims, even when they're in the middle of the crisis, can't do anything. That's what's so different about Zittrain and Herrick, is that Herrick was like living it. He was, while we were in court getting an order of protection and getting filing this case, he was getting visited by 23 people a day that were coming to his home to thinking that they were there to have sex with him. Okay.
Yeah. Jay-Z, you raised your hand. Go
ahead.
I
was just going to say, I think Zittrain was living the moment too. And I think at one point maybe had police protection against the threats he was experiencing. And so it just is an illustration of how timeless the problem is, and how unredressed it's been for the years in between the two cases. The things I would just want to be careful about are, first, again, is there a way to design it so that when the platforms can know pretty formulaically when they need to hop to, rather than it to be this messy fact-specific thing, so that if there's a lawsuit later, again, they can't resolve it on the pleadings. Every lawsuit is going to be discovery and all this kind of stuff. So is there a way to design it that way? But there's a second point that makes me somewhat just self-conscious when having these discussions, which again, we've been having for months, years. They're important discussions independent of our current political moment, but they are not independent of our current political moment. And in that sense, I think of the time that Trump tweeted, "Republicans feel that social media platforms totally silence conservatives' voices. We will strongly regulate or close them down before we can ever allow this to happen." And in introducing, at the press conference, introducing the new executive order from the Justice Department's investigations and meetings and such, this is an order on preventing online censorship. And he says of Twitter, "If it were able to be legally shut down, I would do it." on about, an order preventing online censorship. He's like, I just wish I could shut the whole thing down. And I feel a little bit like a golden retriever just chasing after a doctrinal tennis ball, trying to examine the entrails of this order and what works and what doesn't, when it has been so baldly offered as an instrument of the president's personal vendetta against these platforms that he thinks are biased against him personally. And if they would just treat him more nicely, then he would completely abandon any attempt to change 230. And that just seems to me really important context for the current moment, irrespective of the fact of how serious the problems that we're talking about are.
So I totally agree with that. And I want to get something out on the table. Does anybody on this Zoom call right now believe that there is any merit to the conservative, or it's not even conservative, the Trumpist critique of 230 and the platforms, which is that they are biased against conservative voices?
Yeah.
Will anybody speak up for that?
You could do a poll for that, Ben. But
well, no, but I'm actually soliciting expert opinion here. I mean, I guess I think Trump blows up this whole conversation. Let me just give you a weird example of this. Trump engages in defamation on a routine basis on his Twitter feed. He says things on his Twitter feed that if anybody else in the world said them, they would be the subject of a libel suit. In a 230 environment, Trump is immune because of Nixon v. Fitzgerald, which makes the president immune from civil liability, and the platforms are immune because of 230. So nobody bears liability for defamation. That strikes me as a very weird environment when you have the president accusing people of treason.
I can think of a fix to that doesn't involve having secondary liability without primary liability.
I completely agree with Jonathan. Sorry.
So I am that is not an argument against 230. That is an argument that Trump blows up the system, right? And you end up with these very weird situations because of Trump. But think about it, like sometimes the Lisa Page puppet shows up on In Lieu of Fun. Like, think about it if you were Lisa Page and you have the president saying these things about you on there's the Lisa Page puppet. And, if she wants to have anything to say about this, but, I think that is a weird lacuna in the law created by a combination of Fitzgerald and 230 that is genuinely anomalous in the age of Trump.
There's just so much to be said between having state criminal law enforced against platforms and having private causes of action available, like the kind of thing that Carey does. And I completely agree with Jonathan, in which there is like, I'm not a monster. Like, I don't want Matthew Herrick to be harassed. I think that was bullshit. I think Tinder behaved terribly. Like, there should be
Grindr.
Oh God, yeah.
Don't defame Tinder.
I know I'm defaming Tinder. Sorry, no, it's Grindr. Sorry. I think Grindr behaved terribly, and I think that it was incredibly kind of crazy and not. I'm actually very surprised that they didn't do more, Carey. And I've said this to you before. They didn't do more to try to kind of remedy this from the beginning. But yeah, I guess I do see long term, and I really do, by the way. I want to pivot to digital contact tracing, but we'll kind of close this out with words from Carey and Jonathan. And it sets up well the 230 debate that Carey and I are going to have tomorrow. I just think that 230 is an incredibly useful law, especially when you think about how, as we talk about antitrust in this space and allowing smaller companies and platforms to flourish, if you cast on them civil liability for every defamation that's posted on their site, they would crumble, and you would continue to allow the big companies to get bigger and the smaller companies disappear. And I think that that is also this incredibly kind of weird, like, confluence of opinions from the right, in which they're like espousing this idea of like not doing antitrust and then not doing this. So anyways, Carey, what would you like to say about kind of like your thoughts about 230 reform and like how the last couple of like the DOJ, and we were at you can maybe talk about the DOJ conference we were at together. That was a weird thing.
Yeah, I just think at heart there needs to be a distinction between content and conduct when you're talking about 230. And I think that, I for one, am not going to go to bat on the right to be able to sue a social media company for defamation. I want them to take, to honor court orders saying that this is defamatory, you need to take it down. I don't want them to say, well, we weren't a named party in this case, and so due process doesn't, mean that due process means we don't have to have this order. But then if you actually name them as a party, then Section 230 means that they get dismissed as a party. But I think that's really, really different than conduct-based. When you're letting your platform be used by serial predators, like your dating app, when you are, I have an 11-year-old who was sextorted on Instagram, and then her naked pictures were sent on Instagram. I mean, they have photo DNA on Instagram. They could see that this is an underage person's, profile. And, when you didn't flag it, when the offender tried to post it, they flagged it for him, but they didn't flag it when she was forced to send it to him. Anyways, I think that when we're dealing with cyberstalking, child sexual abuse, serial predators that are known and reported, or sex offenders that are using dating apps, that is really different than a tech company having to make this arbitrary decision as to whether or not something's defamatory, or this fact-based decision.
Yeah, Jay-Z, anything you want to add? And do you want to maybe pivot to the contact tracing conversation?
I would just add, kind of as an analogy to Ben's question about the president's defamation, it might be important to be thinking about what some kind of law enforcement style response to that behavior by primary actors is going to be, if they happen to be people that are in the jurisdiction doing it, engaging in the criminal activity. Like, is there a way to especially prioritize or subsidize, making it clear that like that won't be tolerated? You're going to be in big trouble. You're going to get arrested for that kind of stalking. And what we would then turn to the platforms for is assistance in identifying and finding the people who otherwise might be trying to be anonymous when they do it, if it's clearly criminal activity. And the other thing I would just say is I find it helpful sometimes just to recenter on all of this environment is, at the end of the day, human constructed. It's all like, we could rework anything to be anything if we wanted, if markets demanded it, if regulation and asked for it. What's the world we want to build? And is it just a world of these kind of disembodied feeds of people yapping at one another? Or are there ways to make it more personal? And that's more humane. I mean, that's more of the like, what's the environment? What's the system that we're breathing in? Which is a little bit of a counterpart to who are the worst actors that in any environment are going to do their best to like really hurt people, and how do we deal with them?
Yeah, I love that point. I think that's exactly right. So Jack Sullivan, you've been patiently waiting to ask your question, but we are going to kind of put you, if it's okay and you're okay hanging out, you can text it, you can send a message into the Q&A if you're not. We're going to have you be the last question, the only question, and we're going to kind of put you at the end, and we're going to pivot for a second into the digital contact tracing, because Jay-Z has been working on this specifically for a while, and I'm super interested to hear what he says, and we're kind of running out of time here. So Jay-Z, tell me what you've been working on since the pandemic and everything else.
Well, I've been mostly just talking to and listening to a bunch of people, both from kind of the tech zone of things, some of whom are building apps, some of whom are trying to help set standards. And it includes anything from just somebody in their own house trying to be helpful to Google and Apple designing this exposure notification framework, all on the one hand. And on the other, seeing the traditional public health response, for which, at least until very recently, it has been truly consensus in the public health community that you need, before there's a vaccine or a decent treatment for the disease, you need to have a pretty comprehensive testing, tracing, and supported quarantine or isolation regime in order to make it that people can come out again without the disease roaring back and having the pandemic overloading the hospitals. Once you flatten the curve, you want to keep it flat. And these two groups are not yet well integrating with one another. I think the public health folks are skeptical of tech company solutionism, and the Google Apple framework is one that quite intentionally and mindfully, and for understandable reasons, set its sights to be very limited from the outset. First, put privacy at the apex of anything they were going to do, some combination of their views about privacy and their desire not to be like taken on from the flank for having violated anybody's privacy in this realm, and therefore set up a thing that basically, through some very clever and admirable tools and encryption, makes it so that it can tell who has been proximate to whom over a certain period of time, pseudonymously, without knowing who has been anywhere innately, or even who the people are. That's why it's pseudonymous. And through that, if everybody opts in, a huge if, it could then tell you, once you test positive, okay, I'm now going to notify all the people you were proximate to under some definition of proximate, that they should probably talk to their health authorities and get tested. And then we're piecing out. That's it. And I think that could be a very useful framework. It's not one designed to integrate into the contact tracing work of a traditional public health municipal contact tracing initiative, where you are doing an interview either over the phone or in person with somebody saying, okay, please remember where you've been for the past 2 weeks. Do you have any receipts from stores? If you look in your purse, you can find receipts. That'll help.
Is that really how they're doing it?
That's what they're doing. It's a very stylized interview coupled with the offering of various social services and support. This might be within the first few moments of somebody finding out that they've tested positive and they're freaking out, wondering what they need to do. And having somebody, a human on the other end of the phone, kind of, walking them through it and offering support can be very meaningful, very different from getting a push notification right after your Pokemon Go push that's like, oh, by the way, you've got COVID. Like, that's, not ideal from a human computer interaction standpoint. And looking for ways, as my colleagues Mary Gray and Margaret Bordeaux and Barbara Gross have put it, to allow the technology to be as helpful as it can be at kind of every stage of the process of contact tracing with the work of the contact tracers. I would love to see that, you're talking on the phone with the contact tracer and they say, okay, here's a button you can push on your phone that will ship a bunch of data over or allow it to be accessed by me for a limited period of time to assist in jogging your memory about who you've been near, so that we can really figure out quickly and thoroughly what the other cases out there are. And the hypothesis has been, and in the absence of that, you cannot get the exponential curve to the point where it's not exponential anymore, and you're going to end up with full hospitals. That's been the theory. Now, it appears de facto that basically America, and it goes region by region, so I shouldn't generalize too much, but that America's kind of given up on it, doesn't have patience with that. And as a result, we don't have a comprehensive testing and tracing regime, for which most of the people testing positive are people that have been found thanks to tracing. And if they haven't been found thanks to tracing, your tracing regime isn't good enough. But rather, you've just got a kind of a little bit of a regime there, and then hoping that masks slow the transmission enough and social distancing does, that you've got that so-called R naught value below 1. And that seems like quite a risk to take.
So I guess my confusion about this, 3 months ago, there was an assumption that digital contact tracing was coming, and Google and Apple got together and sketched out an API that they were going to release, which they then did. And some states said they were going to develop apps. And then it kind of disappeared off of the radar screen. And so my question is, where is it beyond this is sort of the same conversation that we were having 3 months ago. And my question is, what has happened on the development, the actual development of useful tools in that period of time?
So the answer is not a lot has happened. And again, we should be clear on the terminology because it maps to a different reality. The Apple-Google framework is not even offered as digital contact tracing. It's not. It is merely, quote, exposure notification based on proximity detection and only that. And it's just meant to say who might be wanting to call the health authorities or going to pursue a test. That's it. That we're done, etc. And that's one reason why maybe you haven't seen as many jurisdictions hastening to develop or try to approve apps based on the framework, because they don't see how it helps in their day-to-day contact tracing work. At most, it would just push more people in to get tested, which is valuable, but different from helping with the contact tracing. Now, you asked specifically what's going on. As best I can tell, there were 3 states that started: Alabama, North Dakota, and South Carolina. They signed on to use the framework. Virginia and Maryland have indicated interest, but it's kind of like after they've got traditional contact tracing up and running to their satisfaction. I don't know of any state that has yet approved or launched an exposure notification app based upon the framework. So it's been slow. And then you have states like Utah that it's almost, you know what it reminds me of? I hate to bring this up, but it basically reminds me of election machine vending after the 2000 election. And you basically have some big contractors trying to offer some turnkey solution. Texas just put out, I think it was around $250 million contract to some firm that nobody had even really heard of to stand up analog contact tracing. And now there's a kind of a big question about, do they know how to do this? How is this working? New York has had its own problems with that. And so you've kind of got these big companies stepping forward for, let me take this off your hands state, but then maybe giving a product that's reminiscent of a Diebold voting machine circa 2002, which, as Ed Felton famously demonstrated, could be opened bypassing its security with a hotel minibar key. That's not the kind of, let's all come together and really think about how tech can help us in this moment and be mindful of privacy too, but let's kind of do that balancing. This is not at the moment what's happening. And I think that's quite worrisome.
I agree with you. I mean, well, I often agree with you, but I would also say in this instance, I have been when I first saw the idea of contact tracing, I was like, this is going to be mostly terrible for privacy, and civil libertarians are going to hate this idea. And they're going to be terrified of the government taking over these information databases once the pandemic is over or while the pandemic is taking place, which I think you've seen some of that. My partner, I think Jay-Z, works for Foursquare, which does a lot of venue matching with geographic places. So their database has primarily been used for ads, but a lot of people have come to them in the last couple of months and been like, are you going to consider using this for contact tracing? That seems problematic to me, given consent and all these kind of various types of kind of issues. But I think that there's just a really hard problem of, I understand that the United States is difficult in this capacity. I actually think that this is the way forward. That plus vaccine, although whatever, we don't need to get into that. I'm the vaccine possibility and everything else. But I would be scared to kind of put all of that stuff up into like a database a little bit, and
Well,
like, and even if it was anonymized. So what do you have to say? Like,
yeah,
would
so
you?
I certainly share your anxiety about it and respect the work that Apple and Google have put in, for instance, in their exposure notification design to make it an entirely distributed database. As stuff is on your phone and there's using tags and hashes so that, you know, there's nothing easily to collect. But there's a whole bunch of trade-offs there. I would be looking, for example, you talk about opt-in. At the point I'm really ready to focus on an opt-in is probably the point at which I got the positive diagnosis, which is about 2 weeks too late to opt in. The phone ought to be recording and storing inside the phone, protected with all the other sensitive information in your phone by your biometric or whatever, all the data it needs so that when you want to opt in, you can do so retroactively to help yourself and society, rather than just waiting until you're ready, which may be too late. And that's the kind of thing that I feel has been off the table because it just feels like such a third rail. And it calls to mind the writings of people like Zeynep Tufekci and Maciej Siglowski, who a pinboard on Twitter, who's basically like, he's Mr. Privacy advocate. He's been like inveighing against privacy abuses for years in an extremely incisive and I dare say entertaining way. And he wrote a blog entry recently that was just like, we need a massive surveillance state. And his thing was just, look, we're already invading your privacy 6 ways from Sunday to sell you Twinkies. Like, this is the time to like buckle down and do it. And he comes from like a former Soviet bloc perspective. So at least it should be on the table, the beginning of a conversation rather than something to end it.
Yeah. Ben, thoughts?
I thought he was just thinking.
He looks very pensive right now, but he's just glitching. He's been texting me outside of this saying that he's glitching really badly and it's kind of bad. Oh no, he like left because he was so badly glitching. You there? You back?
I'm back.
Okay. Thoughts? Thoughts before I land the plane, Ben?
Well, I can offer one thing while you're waiting for Ben too,
Yeah.
which is you pointed out
I'm glitching out, but I'm going to try. I have less anxiety about this.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Sort of.
Yes.
I think I should just bow out because I'm just.
Well, I can try. I'll tell you what.
Let
me try to finish your sentence, which is like, Ben, surely if you're not on board, we really should just give up on trying to deal with the privacy implications. Like, of all people, Ben, I would expect you would be ready to try to figure out some way to overcome privacy worries or objections for the purpose of basically the domestic and national security here.
Yes, exactly. So here's my and just nod when you stop being able to hear me so that I can not be a problem. I think it's all yours.
Well, to respond to what you didn't say, let me just say that trust in government here is so important and it's so variegated, and the variegations I think may bear out as being within the communities that are most being devastated by this pandemic. They're the ones that maybe have the most reason to be nervous about what the government knows about them and might do to them. And it's been so interesting to see New York contact tracers asked not to ask when they do their contact tracing about whether somebody's been to a protest, because that seems like a hugely sensitive question for the government to be asking. Massachusetts kind of gilded the lily by offering up last week a bunch of new testing sites and especially encouraging anybody who's been to a large gathering to, come and get tested. But when you have communities that have reason not to be trustful of the government, exacerbated by government officials, as happened in Minnesota, where the public safety commissioner at the end of May, after protests, said, oh yeah, we're doing contact tracing on the protesters, and that's really helpful. And maybe he meant it by analogy, but like, that's the kind of thing that can just be poison to a public health effort to get people to come forward and be willing to speak. And then I saw Mark Rash asked if some information from contact tracing became relevant in someone's criminal defense, should they be denied that information? It's like, I don't know, like, you know, if it could help an innocent person not go to jail, like, far be it for me to say no. On the other hand, you open the door to that and then it's not private anymore. And, you know, we have certain protections for census data. We have certain protections for tax data. And I'm supportive of efforts at the federal level for signaling reasons, as well as for substantive ones, to pass federal legislation that would protect very fiercely information gathered in the course of contact tracing, and to require a degree of professionalism that may be hard to achieve when you're trying to stand up 100,000 new contact tracers, as Johns Hopkins University estimates we are going to need across the country in such a short period of time.
Well, you know, on the plus side, new jobs. No, I'm not kidding. I actually like, and in fact, you know, you're living with Kate Darling over the past 3 months, and and we had her on the show. And I do think that there is a lot of room for new jobs in these things, and a lot of room for a new kind of thinking about how we shop and how we engage with humanity and like the people. I mean, we're going to interface people or robots in those spaces, but it'll be interesting who we decide. Ben has a question. I'm just going to read it because Ben is glitching so badly. And he says, here's what I was going to say. I am much less concerned about the privacy implications than other people are. Contact tracing is inherently privacy invasive. The entire point of it is to invade people's privacy and thereby find out whom they've been in contact with for purposes of warning those people of health risk. Whether you do it digitally or manually strikes me as not all that important. The question is whether you are doing it well and with good reason, and whether you are keeping the data responsibly and using it for the appropriate purpose. Here, I think, is no question what the purpose is legitimate. So I don't really care if the contact tracing is digital or manual. I care really whether it's done well and sensitively and effectually. And I would agree with that. Like, I think these public health reasons are a great reason to do this type of invasive behavior, but I really, really doubt the ability to keep such data secure against hackers, against leaks, against anything else. And that is really where I think I am more concerned than anything else. What do you think, Jonathan?
Well, just on that front, recognize that those threats are going to be present for both so-called analog and digital tracing, because analog and digital is really referring to the input side. Where do you get the data that you're trying to collect to figure out who's been near whom? Once you collect it, you're going to be typing it into something, and that's going to go into a big database, courtesy of Accenture or whoever, and that's about the back end stuff. So,
and Ben acknowledges that, and he says, "But that's true. However, you collect the data." So
yeah,
exactly.
So I think that is, and you know, for that, those are very real but old challenges. There's just so many opportunities to make new mistakes here as you're on the input side collecting data and looking for ways to do it efficiently and with way more accuracy and thoroughness than you could if you were trying to do the traditional interview-based format. And with COVID in particular, and it varies by illness, and this particular illness, it appears to be a huge difference, all else being equal, which is a huge asterisk itself, between 1 day's work in tracking down contacts and 3 days work in doing it. And if that matters that much, even something that would make the contact tracing interview for the same amount of information extracted be half the length, that is itself a huge turbocharge to the process. And for anybody interested, there have been a number of really good reports from different think tanks, universities. The SAFRA Center has one. The Center for American Progress has one. American Enterprise Institute. Even the official White House plan talks about how vital. One of the 3 pillars of the White House plan is testing and tracing. And yet, it ain't, you know, this is another story of kind of not just federal abdication, but White House hostility to doing it and doing it right. And with that, we're left trying to pick up the pieces at the state and local levels. And it may be that if it's that way, it's that much harder to have a universal database that could then leak all at once, OPM style. But it is really putting the people of this country at a disadvantage. And I just salute the public health folks that are gamely taking up the challenge as best they can. And I salute the tech people who are trying to get up to speed on an area they don't really know anything about. I'm closer to that than I am to the first group. But to that group, I think it's worthy that they're working on it and, mindful of their solutionist tendencies and the drawbacks to that. I think this is the kind of thing where, like, we should be coming together and working on, and leaving few stones unturned.
Yeah, I agree. I very much agree. Okay, we're going to close with a question from Jack Sullivan, who's very patiently waited for half an hour to ask this question. So to Jay-Z. So Jack, go ahead.
Well, it goes back to the earlier discussion about the kind of irresponsibility that's invited by making comments anonymously. And so I followed this thing on real time on Twitter and Ben posted a photograph of that had been put out by a police department in Maryland. This is this angry bicyclist who basically assaulted some kids who were posting leaflets or posters that he didn't like. And you could see what was going to happen, which was that there was a real risk that some people were going to be falsely identified, which is what happened. And it caused these people real, immediate, substantial harm. And the question is whether there's an effective remedy for that helps to deter that kind of thing from going on.
Well, unless we think of the remedy as ultimately a cash payment for their troubles, which, that's what the whole tort system is premised on. So don't let me knock that too much.
You teach torts.
Yeah. But also, most of those people would rather have, in lieu of cash, they'd rather have their fun back and not have been accused to begin.
I see what you did there.
And that gets back to the thorny questions around the spread of mis and disinformation and the role of platforms and responsibilities of those platforms in dealing with it, when there doesn't so much exist a neutral amplification, because they're having to make all sorts of decisions, whether by humans or by the algorithms they write, about of the million things that could be shoved into your feed right now. What are you going to see? And will it be a purported identification of that bicycle guy? And is there a way to be dealing with that misinformation? Should a tweet that you saw and that made an impression on you, in literal and technical terms, last night, when it's egregious and wrong enough, once reality catches up to it, should there be some note like, by the way, what you saw, let me offer you a truth sandwich belatedly on what you saw yesterday.
Truth sandwich. I'm stealing that.
I stole it from George Lakoff, so I'd say you're welcome to it. But it's actually the careful way to detonate a bomb of falsity, and that often by trying to just say X is false, all people remember is X, and ways to deal with that. There's now science around it and a craft around it, and it's in the public interest, not just the private satisfaction of a market to a given platform, to figure out how to do it. We owe people a duty not to have them walk around completely misinformed about stuff that could lead to harm for others or for themselves, and thinking about how to ably do that, realizing all the dangers of trying to have platforms decree truth. They're already ordering stuff. The question is on the table.
Oh, that was a really excellent way. That was a nice way to end things. And I couldn't have predicted that from Jack's question necessarily. So that was wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan, so much for joining us today. This was amazing.
And glad to have the cameos from Jack and Carey.
We do that a lot. But yeah, and Ben's giving you a thumbs up. So I will speak for Ben right now. Ben would say, so Kate, close us out. And then I would say, we're not allowed to have cash anymore, but in lieu of cash, come have fun with us. Jay-Z, thank you so much for coming on. And can you please come back again soon?
Thank you, Jonathan.
I love it. Thanks
and
again.
please come back and talk to us more about contact tracing as it kind of like things build up and become like a little bit more concrete and how things are getting sold out, it would be great to have you on.
That's great. It's my pleasure. There's a COVID-19 tech task force, I think at covidtech.com or something. It's not mine, but I'm already munging the URL. But for those wanting to pitch in, that's great. And our group at the Berkman Klein Center has been coming together around this as well. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. I'll talk to you soon.
See you soon.
Also, I'm giving you a 10 out of 10 on Room Rater. Bye.
Yeah, it's a good room. And that